Hello, everybody. As a Yale School of Management alum and as the founder of Hub 55, a company established both in Brazil and New Haven that works closely with Yale University on Brazil-related efforts, including with the Council on Latin American and Iberian Studies, I am delighted to welcome you to today's career conversation with another Yale alumna, Catherine Osborn, who is also based in Brazil. A little bit about the Council on Latin America and Iberian Studies. The Council enhances the understanding of Latin America and the Iberian Peninsula through collaborative efforts focused on meaningful partnerships and exchange of ideas and academic research. The Council is the central hub for intellectual exchange and partnership in Latin America, Spain, and Portugal, and it also administers the Latin America Studies undergraduate major. If you have not yet officially joined this undergrad, or if you are a graduate student, our graduate network, please visit the Council website to join. Now, I'm very glad to be introducing our guest speaker today, Catherine Osborn, who is joining us from Brazil and has worked throughout Latin America too. Catherine is a Rio de Janeiro-based radio and digital journalist who reports for NPR, The World, Foreign Policy, and other outlets on topics including public policy, health, security, and culture. She writes a weekly newsletter about Latin America politics and economics for Foreign Policy, and in the recent years has closely covered the rise of Brazil's far right, the influence of religion in Brazilian politics, and responses to COVID-19 across the region. Catherine has a bachelor in Latin American Studies from Yale. Thank you very much, Catherine, for being with us today.
Thank you so much for the invitation to speak and to Pamela for the introduction. I'm going to mix the reflections into the career trajectory, and then I look forward to our discussion afterward. Before coming to undergrad, I grew up in Austin, Texas, and I was very interested in politics and current events as a teenager. And a big part of the landscape of those political issues was US-Mexico relations. English is my first language. I had learned Spanish by high school, and at Yale, I was really intrigued by the chance to learn Portuguese and study US-Latin America relations and Latin American policy more broadly. At the start of college, I hoped eventually to have some kind of career that dealt with international relations. And one reason why I chose to major in Latin American studies was that I was still unsure exactly what that would end up looking like. The major allowed for trying out different methodologies. And that's what I really enjoyed about Yale as a whole, trying out both different academic methodologies and also different ways to engage with the world through student activities and internships. As far as academic methodologies with Latin American studies, I especially enjoyed history classes, art history, economics, as well as social science methods courses, one of which led to a field research-based senior essay conducted here in Rio de Janeiro. As far as outside the classroom engagement, I did a lot of student journalism. I interned at a public radio station and at an art museum, and I was also part of a service learning program that did workshops with participants on the history of the US relationship with the Dominican Republic. I'd encourage you guys who are students to look into what connections Yale can provide for getting different internships, and also what university funding that might be available to pay for them. My summer research in Rio for my senior thesis was actually funded by Yale, and one of the internships I did was through a Yale connection. Don't be shy about reaching out to professors, older students, and alums, even with pretty open-ended questions like, if I'm interested in this, what kind of activity might I do in the summer or after graduation, to know more about whether it's a good fit for the long term. It'll be really instructive for you guys to try different things out, and also to reflect on questions like, what about this work is motivating to me, and what might it look like to keep doing this eventually in a career, including what the financial picture looks like. One way that process of trying things out played out for me is that I've always loved the visual arts as a way to bridge between cultures and send different messages about values, history, and politics. Because of that, after my freshman year at Yale, I did an internship at a contemporary art museum in Buenos Aires, Argentina. On the weekends, together with a Yale friend who was also in Buenos Aires at the time, I did some volunteering with a microfinance organization that worked in immigrant neighborhoods. It was really interesting work, and I realized that while I loved the museum and learned an incredible amount from it, I was more energized by talking to people in their communities about day-to-day issues that were facing them. I actually had similar kinds of experiences in New Haven, where as a reporter for student publications, I did some stories about housing policy in the city. At the time, there was a new mixed income development going up on State Street, and Voltaire a controversial that blocked residents from a New Haven public housing complex from easily accessing the city of Hamden. I found doing those interviews a really fascinating way to learn about public policy, how people relate to it, and how they relate to each other. After the experiences in New Haven and Buenos Aires, going forward, I thought maybe my career will be in journalism, or maybe it will be in some kind of NGO work or community development, or maybe it will be in fieldwork focused scholarship, like as a political scientist. I still had that uncertainty when I graduated from Yale. And because of that, I aimed for a project for after graduation that would keep different doors open. The summer after my junior year, when I had been in Rio doing senior essay research, I'd gotten to know a small bilingual news site that covers public policy toward the city's low-income neighborhoods. And the year after graduation, I returned to Rio to report for that site, covering a municipal public works project. The funding that allowed me to do that came from Yale in the form of a year-long fellowship. And I encourage you guys to get information from the fellowship's office about how to access those kinds of funds for projects you might want to do. But I also want to add that a colleague of mine from that period at the Rio News Organization, who was also an American recent college graduate around my age, did not have fellowship funding, but instead had worked at a bar and saved up the money to be able to travel to Rio and do this work. Depending on you all's financial obligations after you graduate, there are different pathways to funding an independent project like that. Another colleague who was a freelance journalist in Rio for many years did it while paying off quite a bit of student debt. And it was definitely not easy, but it was possible, and in her opinion, ultimately a really rewarding experience. What helped her, and eventually me, pay the bills as a freelancer was side work translating and researching for other journalists. That option is a real upside of getting your language skills sharp in college or soon afterward. In addition to foreign language skills per se, I also encourage anyone interested in careers in international development, politics, or reporting of any kind to take a couple of economics classes, or otherwise find a way to familiarize yourselves with current debates about international trade, public finance, and development. For those of you who know you're interested in journalism, even if you're not 100% sure about it as a career, I definitely recommend doing some stories for student publications and, if possible, interning at a news organization. For me, those experiences helped me place some freelance stories from Brazil soon after graduating from Yale, in part because I knew how to report and put together a story in text and audio, and also how to pitch one. I had chosen to go to a place as well where there was lots of international interest in current events. Brazil makes up around 30% of the region's GDP and population, which is good to keep in mind if you're interested in a career in Latin America and you're on the fence about how far you want to keep studying Portuguese. After I spent that first post-college year at the Rio News Organization, I started a mix of freelance reporting and freelance translating work. And it was a good 2 or so more years before I fully decided that I wanted to work in journalism for the medium to long term and not try to go to grad school in the social sciences. That decision-making process was gradual and came about both through having a couple of years of evidence that A, this was financially sustainable, B, I had a community of colleagues who I respected, trusted, and could lean on for support, and C, I really loved the work and felt that it would be dynamic and intellectually satisfying over a long period of time. I grew more comfortable with the fact that being a reporter meant I'm not the one writing the most comprehensive, exhaustive account of a certain topic or giving the final word about it, but rather trying to add context to people's understanding of events as they unfold. I also appreciated that trying to do fair and rigorous reporting forced me to challenge my own preconceptions and develop a thicker skin. From that freelance starting point, which was in 2013, I contributed coverage to outlets like NPR, The World, and Foreign Policy about topics including the impact of the Rio World Cup and Olympics on the city's low-income communities, attempts at police reform, public security more broadly, a Brazilian presidential impeachment in 2016, and debates surrounding Brazilian anti-poverty programs and how you classify people as moving into the middle class. I also covered feminist and Black activist movements, the rise of Brazil's far right, the role of religion and evangelical Christianity in many of these topics, a water crisis in South America's largest city, a disaster at a mining dam, the role of startup in modernizing the business landscape in Latin America, and the growing role of Chinese development finance and investment in the region. We can talk about any of these stories afterward if you guys are curious. In this reporting, some of the questions I most appreciate being able to approach include: what constitutes development? How do countries wield the influence they have in the international sphere? How do theory and actions from the global south change mainstream debates on those issues? And how do people demonstrate autonomy in their own lives in the face of pretty intractable structural challenges? Those don't come up in every story, and part of freelancing is learning which kinds of publications are interested in which kinds of stories, and how style varies from one publication to another. As in other fields, freelance journalism involves a process of building trust and a good track record with your supervisors, which in journalism is your editors. So they're eventually open to ideas that might appear more out on a limb at first. One of the stories I'm proudest of doing for NPR is about a young men's barber shop on the outskirts of Rio, and how the men's haircuts and the conversations they had with them showed changing norms around gender and race. Along the way to being able to do those kinds of stories, I've done a lot of assistant work for other journalists, which was really valuable to learning the ropes, expectations of the industry. Whether it's journalism you guys are interested in, or something like advocacy work or diplomacy, each field is going to have a whole ecosystem of actors and different philosophies about how to do things. And often you only really get to see how all of that works by being in an entry-level or assistant position. So I'd encourage you to relish those opportunities and learn all you can from them. Don't think that because you went to Yale, you shouldn't start at the bottom of the food chain. You can always be learning something, and it's not always going to be from whom you expect. For me, over what's now around 8 years of reporting and countless interactions with sources and all kinds of readers and listeners, I've increasingly appreciated journalism's ability to establish a trustworthy set of facts on an issue that are accessible to people from different political beliefs and to people who don't have lots of previous knowledge about the topic at hand. This goal may sound banal, and sometimes journalism falls short of it and doesn't even achieve it. But at its best, journalism can contribute to evidence-based solutions to problems and to people's ability to have empathy, joy, pride, and solidarity. At its best, I think journalism can also bring to life issues that at first may sound technical and boring, like there's nothing to see here, but are actually at the heart of how countries, companies, and people exercise power over others. As one example of this, I and other colleagues are currently covering how multinational lending organizations like the IMF are treating lower and middle income countries that took on lots of debt to pay for their COVID-19 unemployment benefits and stimulus packages. There's a debate inside the IMF and among private sector lenders about how strict the repayment terms should be and how the speed of repayment should affect the country's credit ratings. This will affect the country's abilities to choose their social and economic policies in the next few years. It's also connected to the climate crisis because harsh restrictions on these countries' budgets mean more difficulty funding green transitions. As a reporter, it's ultimately impossible to know the full extent of who's reading your work and how it influences people. But it is possible to gear work towards certain audiences. And over the years, I've increasingly sought to write for audiences that include policymakers and that are ideologically diverse. Those are some of the goals of the newsletter that I currently write for Foreign Policy, which covers business, politics, and culture in Latin America. I'm sure that as you guys move forward on your different paths, your opinions will change over time too, about what you hope to achieve in your work. As those views evolve, I encourage you to maintain an open discussion about them with colleagues, friends, and mentors, especially those from different backgrounds than you. Those conversations will be incredibly rich and help guide you. At the same time, keep in mind that you have your own goals and needs that don't perfectly match on to those of any one other person. It's by walking down your own path that you'll figure out what makes sense for you. One final piece of advice is to enjoy it and have fun on the journey. I'll stop there and I look forward to you guys' questions and chatting more.
Okay.